Perfect. Are you broadcasting? Mm-hmm. You can come and see. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Start. Hello and welcome to my second webinar. I'm sure one by one people will start joining. Oh, hello. We have people already in. Welcome, welcome. I just thought I'll do a quick orientation to how the Zoom works. And so at the bottom of your screen, you will see these two buttons, chat and Q&A. So number one, use the chat to make comments to me or to everybody, and use Q&A to ask me questions. So let's keep the questions in the Q&A. And I kind of have put some questions there. When you want to answer, type your answers. So let's get started. We have a jam-packed session. We have lots to share, lots to talk about. A little bit about myself. I am the founder and creator of ExQ. It's an online curriculum directly addressing the needs of students in middle school to college. And it develops cognitive abilities and, most importantly, the self-awareness that's essential. I also have a podcast. I'm going to make references to many experts on my podcast as a resource, which I will be sharing with you in the handout that you'll get at the end when we finish today. And of course, there are some additional resources on my site, which I will share as well. So today, the topic is back to school, developing executive function skills to shape successful school year. And so those who are parents in the audience may not be fully aware of the term executive function, but we have a lot of experts such as speech language pathologists and counselors and psychologists who may be more familiar with that than average person, because this is not a term that we often describe in everyday life. So what does getting back to school look like? So here are some situations. You know, if you're running with shoelaces untied, that's something requires executive function. If you go to school and you don't have friends, like this little young boy here, he needs to make friends. That requires executive function. You know, waking up on time to get to the classes requires executive function. And standing up to a bully also requires executive function. So I have a cute clip. I don't know if you're familiar with the show The Middle, and this captures everything that we all are struggling to help our children overcome. So let's watch it.
Axel! Axel, get out of bed now! No! I said now! Okay, I know this doesn't look good, but in fairness to me, this wasn't how the morning started. Axel, honey, time to get up. Come on, sleepyhead. Rise and shine. Axel, the bus comes in 15 minutes. Let's go. You get the picture.
So, as you can see, the devil in the mom is probably what the children see, but they probably fail to see this progression of gentle nudge, cajoling, and eventually losing it. So executive function is a set of mental skills used to manage our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors to achieve goals. But the most important caveat is for self. So this is something the self does for self. You know, Naglieri and Goldstein are researchers who describe executive function as how efficiently you do what you decide to do. So there are two parts to it. One is you need to decide, and second, you need to do. And this is the gap that we often notice with children who fail to decide. That means they don't have the motivation, or they actually don't do what they say they want to do, and the follow through is a big problem. And if you notice these two essential breakdown in elements of behavior, then that certainly captures executive function. So often executive function as a job of the prefrontal cortex is described as a air traffic controller of the brain, which actually supervises, inhibits, and directs the rest of the brain functioning towards the goals that one has for self. And so that requires two kinds of systems. One is called activation system, and one is called inhibition system. That means, yeah, sure, keep going, keep doing, and stop. No, not now. So those two systems, when they're in sync with each other and they actually are appropriately working in the context of the world, then we say we have great executive functioning. So in order to talk about executive function and the nature that I'm talking about, the self at the heart of it, it is in order to serve the needs of the self. It is done by the self, all by yourself, and it is done by managing self. That means to remove the distractions if you need to. If you need to slow down, you need to do that. If you need to speed up, you need to do that. But all that needs to be done by self. Now, the caveat here is, what if you are a young child who doesn't have the proficiency and skills that are required to stop oneself? So if you're playing with Legos and it's time to go because mom is calling for dinner, that requires you to stop by self. And if you don't, then mom comes and grabs the Legos, puts them away, then that certainly is a problem for students. And then let's think about the next part. So doing by yourself, if you can't, then asking for help by yourself. So as a child who doesn't have these skills and proficiency in these areas, the child is not going to actually be able to do these skills and understand how to achieve the goals. Then he needs to have the wisdom or understanding to seek help. So there are two problems for children. One, they don't have the skills that are proficient yet, but they don't have the wisdom to seek help. And then third part is they actually don't follow through with the suggestions that somebody makes. So considering all these three elements, that's why executive function really become very critical in the way a student manages the needs of oneself and achieves success for self. So let's go back to Axel. As you can see, he needs to have goals for self. So getting up on time should be a goal for him. Done all by self is he should set the alarm, or when he hears the alarm, he should wake up by self. And by managing self, that means part of his management should include not getting mom aggravated. And that social context is really, really important when we talk about executive function. So very important when people are dealing with children's executive function, this is a simple rule, but a profoundly important principle. So what is that? So here it is, that if you advise the child, and if your ideas you're imposing or suggesting or presenting to the child, guess what? Your executive functions go into it. So for the idea to be executed, followed up with, and kind of imbibed as personal value, the student or the child needs to come up with those ideas for self. So until the baton is not handed back to the child, your executive functions are getting better. So one of the things that teachers, educators, and even those help or coach students often get in trouble with is because they are organizing the classrooms, they are organizing the homework, they are organizing students' engagement with their peers. But as long as you keep doing it, your executive functions are going into it, and that will not allow the child to master their own executive function. So simply put, if you say to the child, clean up your room or get started with the homework, you were the executive there and the child's brain did not engage. So the best thing is to say, what do you think I want you to do? It will be a great way to redirect the child to think about these rules for themselves. So take a moment and type out some answers here. What school-related executive function skills do you think matter the most? And I'll wait for a second. And maybe you can practice your executive function, which is listening to me and figuring out how to type in the question answers or comments. I have my window open, so some of you may want to participate. All right, so someone is saying that getting to places on time. That's a great executive function skill. why don't you think about the next set of questions that we are talking about, which is school readiness. So here are the list of skills that I think really are critical. And I'm going to let you read the slide. It is a little bit dense. So it's know what to do, when to do it, and how to do it, focus when needed, or discover you're not focusing and redirect your attention, control your own impulsivity. You need to stop when there's a need and somebody says stop. You need to get started when somebody says it's time to get started. Ask help when needed. So all these skills are essential executive skills for school success. And most importantly, last two elements are really, really critical, which is keeping emotions under control and solving personal problems. So how does executive function demonstrate in everyday life? So the child or a adolescent or even young adult who's not showing these proficiencies will appear like this: distracted, impatient, unmotivated, forgetful, unthoughtful, sometimes rude, lost, stressed out, impulsive, oblivious, often and frequent mood swings, ups and downs. Smallest thing kind of upsets too easily, but the upsetness lasts for too long, taking too long to adjust. Sluggish in the mornings, for example, sluggish when after dinner or after a meal, uncooperative, and work is often incomplete. So that kind of summarizes the real life challenges that somebody demonstrates these skills. And we have some comments here. So having wiggles is a very common thing, that be not just being sitting still and not holding pencil, kind of tapping pencils. In fact, I was in a meeting yesterday, and there were two adults in the meeting, a group of 10 people. Two people were tapping their pencils. One was shaking their leg. So these are some of the things that when some child becomes an adult, some of these become less interfering skill set, but they are still present, but they manifest themselves in a different way. Also, some of the, Gayatri saying that doing homework without being told is a great kind of challenge because the idea needs to be the child's idea that it's time, I have homework, I need to get started, and I know where to find it. So these three barriers can really create problems for a child to stay on top of it. So now going back to this idea of, does your child look like this? Or the child that's coming to school looks like this? Maybe the answer is not. And I found this very cute clip. Take a minute to look at it.
Andrew, are you excited for pre-kindergarten?
Yes.
Why?
I don't know.
Are you going to miss your mom?
No.
No? Oh, don't cry. Are you?
So this is a great example of how the child's goal was to be in school. He was excited because he knows he's going to have fun, but he had literally not done something called future planning. He had not thought about the future. And so the future entailed being in school without mom. And when the reporter reminded, of course, the child says, wait a minute, yeah, that's actually true. And you saw that he had difficulty. But that kind of crying is appropriate for a pre-kindergartner entering school. But this kind of emotional resistance or having anxiety or feeling extremely stressed out because you don't know the unknown, particularly middle school and high school kids, the transitions are really hard. So what we are focusing on today is the transition skills. So the most important executive function skills, how to adapt and shift flexibly in the most challenging circumstances. And the circumstances are not challenging because they demand a lot out of you, but they just demand something different. So by the way, why do you guys think transitions are hard for kids? Can you take a minute and maybe type out a few answers? So great. So I think we have a couple of comments here. One is there's unknown future, a demand on having to shift focus, resistance to change. Fantastic. Yes, you're absolutely right. And nobody likes changes, including adults. I mean, and so particularly summer is so groovy. Why would you like to get ready for something that it requires a lot of focus? So let's talk about 4 types of transition. So transitions are 4 kinds, as I said, and the easiest is the first one, which is leisure to leisure. You just finish playing basketball with your friends, and you all decide to go for a pizza. Great transition. No stress, nothing involved, just getting into continuing to have fun. The second kind of transition, of course, is work to leisure, which also is a much better transition because you're shifting from having to finish work and then going into leisure. So you kind of can easily turn your brain off. This is what happens to on Friday. So the TGIF type of transition. The third is leisure to work. Now, the leisure to work is also not that hard, but hard. Let's say if the parents say, we just finished taking a bike around the neighborhood. Now, after you go back, why don't you change clothes and start with your homework? You have had fun, you're energized, so it can sustain some motivation. So that kind of transition is really not hard. But the last transition is really, really hard. And that is the transition which puts the child's executive function to test, which is work-to-work transition. So you just finished Spanish, now you need to go into math class, or you just finished taking a test, and then you have to now practice your vocab in Spanish. Excuse me. Was not planning to bring a drink into this video, but you got to see that. All right. So let's talk about why transitions are so hard. So first of all, it requires sustained attention on the task 1, and it requires maintaining that mental set that requires the work to be done. And then switching requires disengaging that attention and re-engaging that attention into something new. And a lot of people get lost in this re-engaging. And I don't know, parents who might be listening, you might have noticed, you tell your kid, go upstairs, change your clothes, get into bed, and I will read a book to you. And the child, after 10, 15 minutes, you are ready to go upstairs, and the child is sitting on the stairs because he found a piece of Lego. So that transition, he did disengage because you told the child to do so. But as soon as he climbed up the stair and saw a Lego piece, he disengaged. He engaged and re-engaged into something that was fun but irrelevant. So this kind of thing that often happens, that the teachers and educators find that kids come into school, but they just are not prepared to disengage without resistance and re-engage with enthusiasm. Look at the summer versus school transition. In the summer, you're free to swim as much as you want, wherever, with your friends. You can, you may not want to take laps, you just want to do jumps, fine. That is unstructured and it is loose. And then comes summer, post-summer school engagement. And if the child is taking a swim class, so now the child has to really manage his focus. He has to be ready when the whistle goes off. He has to stay in the lane. He has to actually complete the number of laps the coach wants. So now it becomes very regimented, and the fun may not look like fun. Now, another comment I quickly want to make about fun is oftentimes kids consider when I don't get my way, it's not fun. And guess what happens in school? They don't get their way. And that's not because somebody's a dictator, but that's the nature of learning. Well, how can we expect a kid to have the wisdom to know what they need to learn and what they're learning is important? There's some type of surrender needs to be there. And that resistance is actually executive dysfunction or executive function resistance. So let's talk about starting some strategies here. It's really important that you as parents and you as educators build an EF culture. So what does EF culture mean? Executive function culture means, is your brain is in charge of the rest of your brain? Is your boss brain dictating and telling your worker brain to get the work done? That's the EF culture. The EF culture is, until, my dear child, you develop these skills and abilities, would you please collaborate with me and allow me to be your boss brain? And so that understanding is the EF culture. So a strong EF culture is such that the expectations match the level of readiness. So if your kid is not independent, it is really unfair to the kid for you to expect them to do the stuff that you're expecting them to do. So if the child is in elementary school and is not waking up by himself or herself, it's okay to wake that child up. But if the child is in middle school, and if you haven't put that demand to wake up by yourself or do your homework by yourself, then it's time to do that because the peers are doing it and the school is expecting it. Second thing, reflection is essential. And the reflection often happens when a mistake happens. And I recommend that an EF culture is such that the reflection is integral to living daily life, not because there's a mistake. And often the way reflection might be done is there's either a punitive connotation or there's a shaming connotation. So if you kind of bring those two elements of social emotional adjustment, then the child certainly is unwilling to reflect or take ownership of the mistake or ownership of a mishap, because certainly the child doesn't feel good. Third, mistakes are an essential part of growing up. And again, often I suggest to parents and teachers in this context that please demonstrate your mistakes. Even teachers, as you're writing on the board, if you make a spelling mistake, stop, don't erase it. Point it out and say, look, guys, what I did. Secondly, if you kind of pulled up a wrong homework, or if you said to a kid, why don't you have it? I posted it. And the kid points out, no, Mrs. Smith, you didn't post it. And you say, wait a minute. You go log in and say, oh, yes, I did not post it. I'm so sorry, kids. So what you're doing is you're revealing that mistakes are organic to the process of learning, and mistakes are organic to being a human. And so when you do that, you are enhancing and you're creating an EF culture. The fourth thing is take time for mindfulness and to be mindful. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that entails, and I have some goodies for you to think about. And lastly, we know who we are. So that is called identity and a purpose-filled culture. So we'll talk about that. So ready? Let's get started. So first of all, I'm going to share with you a few strategies. So number one, to handle transitions, use some type of timers or warning, audible warning to suggest. So if you're a classroom teacher, if you're a therapist, or even as a parent, have different kind of warning signals. And iPhones are so great, or technology is so great that you can actually get different type of ringtones. I, in fact, have 5 types of bells, some at home and some I bring to my office. And these bells suggest different type of transition. So if you're doing leisure to work transition, you can have a gong, let's say. If you're doing work to work transition, you can have a bell. What you're doing is you're alerting the child to get emotionally and psychologically and executively ready to adjust to the newer demands that are different than the current demands. And the reason to keep this marker, and I'm a big proponent of nonverbal engagement. Please do not make everything verbal. And the best way to catch the child's attention is to pause and say nothing. And this is so hard because, one, we are strapped for time, and two, we are not getting the cooperation and attention from a distracted child and child who doesn't know what the goals are. And so we become very verbose. So one of the things I'm encouraging you all to think about is to use silence as the biggest tool for teaching executive function. Second thing is facilitate fun kind of introduce something gamify your transitions, particularly so that the adjustment, the emotional adjustment that goes into. So let's say the child does not like math and hates doing math homework. And you kind of have been cajoling, begging, even bribing, giving candies, or saying, we will go to the park. All those things are great to get immediate attention, but they're not going to be lasting long because it's external motivation. So you can actually maybe have a mini puzzle, let's say, and say, let's do 1/4 of a puzzle now, and then 1/4 of the puzzle after you finish math, 1/4 of the puzzle after you finish science, whatever. And then we finish the puzzle at the end of the homework, and then we can all have fun. Having fun is something that you need to pick and choose that the child really cares about. I think sometimes we make a mistake of offering that as a reward. for completion, but why not use that as a tool for self-regulation? Third is facilitate a challenge to challenge transition with games and scavenger hunt. I love scavenger hunt. Scavenger hunt is a way, so your next assignment is hidden in the living room, or the teacher can say your next assignment is on top of something that's yellow. So now the child has to look around, and this is one of the best ways you can get the child to refocus. And I would like to bring your attention to something called affective coloring. Affective coloring is when a unfavorable emotional encounter happens, it affects us, and that the way we get affected, we carry that into the next situation. So more serious the emotional encounter that was, you got really, really upset, you will stay upset for 4 hours. If somebody cut you off in traffic, that a little annoyance that you felt may be carried out during the first period in the class. Now, what happens in this affective coloring? Your own executive functions are not under your check. So they are not kept in check by you because you're a little irritated. So when you are irritated, you're short. And so the scavenger hunt, or things like giving a child an opportunity to adjust, is a really good way to give yourself a little break so you can retweak and maybe modulate your own emotional failure to adjust. Here's a quick example. So impulse control is quite often a very characteristic of a child having struggles with adjusting their to the demands of everyday life. So, for example, this girl was doing her homework, and suddenly she got a text from her girlfriend that the boy she likes is actually talking to a girl that she hates. Now, this is a drama, right? Middle school drama, high school drama. And she now has to control the impulse of giving up science, studying for science because there's a test tomorrow, and stay and ignore the phone. But the affective coloring is such that you will not ignore the phone. This boy just comes back from a soccer practice and he's thirsty. He goes straight to the refrigerator and he drinks milk straight from the bottle. This certainly he's demonstrating that he has no consideration for the family that lives and drinks the same milk. So how do we get children to be less impulsive? And the last example is, I can't really speak for it because I have 1,000 tabs open myself, but literally the impulse to keep multiple tabs open so you can toggle between two ideas, something fun, something boring, keeping a shopping window open while you're actually writing a paper, and you go back and forth because you're getting bored. So I often like to describe this, when you go to a department store and they squirt different perfumes and you're deciding which one to buy, they keep coffee beans. And do you know why coffee beans are there? Because the coffee beans, when you sniff on them, they kind of neutralize the smell. So you can smell the intensity and nuances of the next perfume really well. So think about coffee beans for your brain. What does that look like? That exactly is what you need for transitions. So let's quickly talk about boredom. So boredom is a typical sign of executive mismanagement. So boredom is actually having no sense of purpose in the activity that is assigned by the other. So it's not my goal to do the homework, but apparently it's my parents' goal, it's my teacher's goal. So I am forced to do the homework, which I don't like, and so I'm getting bored. So two things happen. I either take too long to do it, or secondly, my quality of work really suffers. So if are you noticing this in your children that you're teaching or dealing with or raising, that they often get bored? So I think this boredom is a real critical issue. And one of the things that as a culture, we have somehow demonstrated that we have no patience for things. Right now, in fact, we really get bored when a page is loading, right? We really get bored when you have ordered the coffee and you're waiting for the coffee to come through. So we immediately take our phone. We get bored at a traffic light. Does that happen to you all? So that boredom is literally saying, I need to be constantly engaged and the world needs to entertain me. And the challenge with education is the world of education is not going to entertain you because not all learning is going to be entertaining. It is going to be challenging and fun and informative, but it's not entertaining like a video game. And so that's where the children often get lost. So few rules that I highly recommend you to consider. One is avoid entertaining your kids with smartphones and iPads. A lot of times parents are offering that as a reward, or they get to be on their iPads because they have taken care of the responsibilities. So part of what I would ask you to do, practice. So practicing standing still, practicing looking around, practicing observing people. So maybe creating opportunities where you actually go. So if you're a teacher in the classroom, why don't you pause before you begin and say, I want you to notice. And I used to do this with my kids, and in my clinic, I did that all the time, and I continue to do, is I would rearrange 3 things. So for example, you see the painting behind, and I have another Einstein painting in the office. I would swap them, and the kids would come for a group training session, and I would say, there are 3 things that have changed. Please find out what has changed. And they would look around, and there would be a great sense of competition and excitement, because normally they would come in and they would behave like a victim of learning. They would sit next to you, in front of you, and say, okay, tell me what I need to do. So if your kids are doing that, why don't you create some type of challenge, but do not entertain them, or do not allow them to desire for entertainment. A lot of research, we don't have time in this podcast to talk about this, but if you're familiar with Jean Twenge's work, I really recommend you all to read her book called iGen. And there's incredible data that's coming out because of the introduction of smartphones, what kind of social psychological ramifications have begun to show, and not just in a shorter period, but significantly, because the smartphones became affordable in 2011. So since 2011, so in the last 8 years, we are noticing a significant mental health decline. So really being able to not needing that type of engagement. I just want to point out another thing which you already know, that why smartphones, iPads, and technology is so exciting, because it constantly changes. It doesn't ask questions. It doesn't require reflection, and there is no mistake making. That means, let's say if I'm playing a video game, I get killed, I get reborn, and I buy some more tools, and I continue playing. So if that's who I am, then I can be entertained, because the world around me is adapting to me, not me to the world. Second thing, establish downtime without tools and gadgets, and which kind of goes hand in hand with the first thing I said, which is kind of saying that no, so there's a real strict rules that if you can kind of, and I really encourage educators to kind of collaborate with parents and come up with smart rules, technology rules for 6th grade, technology rules for 7th grade. So imagine you coming up with some kind of rules and collaborating with your parents and jointly getting the child to sign a contract and saying, this year, as I begin my school year, I agree to follow these rules. Third is explore the world with 5 senses. A lot of times what's not happening is going for walks or exploring the world, kind of even noticing bird watching. I guess bird watching is the most boring hobby people have. Apparently I was reading somewhere, but that requires incredible focus, and that requires incredible knowledge of the birds. And I don't have that, but I'm just saying, what is it in your daily life that requires you to engage in exploration? Most often we create routines which take away the demand on exploration. So a balance between routine and exploration is really, really helpful. So let's talk about, let's quickly talk about this idea of mindfulness practice. I have this amazing game. I have a podcast, series of podcasts with experts who have studied mindfulness and have great information as well as suggestions for parents and teachers. So I highly recommend that we create mindfulness practices. So here's one example for it. This is Christopher Willard's book, and this is one of my favorite books. So if you have elementary school children, or if you have even maybe 6th and 7th grade, you can try it. But it's the alphabet-based breathing techniques. It's a fantastic thing. You can take each page, and you can, for example, here is a, oh, I love this, which is called a cake breath, which is a breathe in as you imagine a birthday cake, breathe out as you imagine blowing out the candles. So that's C for cake breathing. So now imagine if you're sitting down before dinner, you can say, let's do cake breathing today. And all of you, including husbands, wives, children, grandparents, all of you do the cake breathing. Imagine a teacher saying that, you know what, we are about to end the class. Before you leave, before you pack up, let's do cake breathing. So now you have concretized the process of mindfulness. There's also another fantastic, there are multiple resources which I'll plug in for you guys, but this is Annika Harris, and she also has a website which has guided meditation, which includes the sound meditation I talked about, but they have created this amazing games. I don't know if you can see it, but I'll list it. And they're called Mindful Games activity cards. And I use this for younger children, but also it's great fun to do it as a group. I have done this with college kids. Of course, they find it extremely weird. Why do I need to focus? But my work has helped me identify that as I launched my pilot of ExQ, which is the software, and through the training, as I interviewed the kids who finished the training, these were middle school kids, one of the girls said to me, you know what, my teachers have never told me I could breathe. That was so touching to me. I don't think the teachers knew that she needed a little nudge to be reminded about breathing, but this executive function training that she engaged with reminded that when things got really hard, take a deep breath. And that pausing to take a deep breath is a self-initiated self-regulation. That means I notice I'm getting stressed, I pause, and I make myself take a breath. So this kind of wisdom can be extremely helpful. So let's talk about the next part, which is routines. Can you take a minute and maybe type what do you think is how do you define a routine? Any ideas? So someone is saying that routine is something that happens every day, something you do same way every day. Great definition. Thank you, Jennifer. So let's talk about something which you do at a certain time and in a specific way. Fantastic. So I want you to kind of really think about habits and routines. So a lot of times adults who are working with children think that because I have a routine, you have a routine with me. Now, one problem there is routines are inherent to behavior and living a life, and they're not transparent. So the way I define a routine is predetermined sequence of events that repeat itself. So the sequence is predetermined, and typically a five-step of sequence is a great routine. More than 5 goes beyond your working memory. And secondly, you must get your children to memorize what those 5 steps look like. And they don't need to actually execute the routine until they have memorized it. So the precursor to following a routine is the routine needs to be made explicit. So if you have a routine, like I always bring the kids home, I tell them to hang their backpack, I tell them to get ready for a snack, I put the snack in front of them, I tell them to get started with the homework. That's a routine, but guess what? It's your routine. So whose executive function went into it? Yours. So the idea here is write down the routine, put the routine on a slate, and have the child memorize the routine. And when you come into the house, come into the classroom, ask the children to verbally state the routine. So here's a very critical element of executive function management. A rehearsal, which is reminding yourself to remember, is an integral part of following up with a routine. And in order to do that, you need to be able to say the routine, speak the 5 steps, see the 5 steps written down somewhere. I highly recommend you type them up and laminate them and have your child do a check. This physical action of doing a check is an essential aspect of rehearsal. The third part is by the way, all these things must be done before you do. So you say before you do, you see before you do, and you think before you do. So the third part is a more sophisticated executive function ability, which is conceptualizing a routine by closing your eyes and watching yourself do the actions in the routine. So this watching is, by the way, by age 9, we develop this videography skill in the brain. The brain has the capacity to actually play back a video of you taking actions in the future. So this connection to the future is a critical part for all of you to think about building executive function with respect to the routines. So let's talk about 5 once-a-day habits that I really think will be essential. So one is establish distracting free zone, time and space. So I think some parents feel that they divide and conquer. So the dad goes and does his thing, mom is doing her thing, and both are not doing the same thing in terms of behaviors. So when mom is following up a routine, dad is sitting there on his cell phone. That is really not a distraction-free zone. So you and your husband come to an agreement, say, hey, honey, can we make 4 to 6 a distraction-free zone? No usage of cell phone, no taking calls, and we are going to dedicate this time to our children. And children are not allowed to get on technology during that time. Now, it will be really hard to spring this on your teenager if you haven't done this already. So you may want to slow into it. The time aspect, as I mentioned, is the window of time. And time aspect is also weekend versus weekday markers. So the weekend routine needs to be established as well. The space is kind of creating sacred places in the house where we do not take technology, we do not talk and interrupt people. So whatever, so a lot of times I think we have households where we have in the living room, we have television, we have iPads on the kitchen counter, we have kitchen table where kids do homework, but the TV may be on, but on mute. This is another phenomenon I have noticed a lot, that people have TV on all the time. And the parents are actually talking to the kid, but they are occasionally, their eyes are up at the TV. And if they notice something interesting, they unmute the TV. So if you're doing this you are transitioning from boring to fun because you're considering parenting to be boring. Sorry, I don't mean it that way, but I think it is exhausting. So when you're exhausted, what do? You look for entertainment. So second thing is recognize using a circle of Zorro. So my goodness, what's his name? Sean, I'm forgetting his name, but he talks about circle of Zorro, which is the way I apply it is this is a sacred circle where in order to reduce the sense of overwhelm that we put on our kids all the time, why don't we give them a very focused opportunity to clean or get control over their environment. So instead of telling them to clean the entire room, why don't you create a circle of Zorro and say, listen, in this circle, I don't want to see a mess. Because when you don't have a space where you can work distraction free, then it's really hard for you to focus. So you determine in your house that when you send your kid to clean up their room, and if you don't have time, then just say, just clean the circle of Zorro. So same thing with the teachers, you can create your desk as a circle of Zorro. So when you tell them, okay, it's time to prepare for a test, create a circle of Zorro, now they need to know. So the idea is, again, I am asking you to avoid this language saying to your children, clean your desk now, clean your room now, because if it's your idea, your executive functions went into it. Got it? So when you use the ambiguous phrasing such as circle of Zorro, they need to know, I need to take the initiative to check if my space is clean. I need to take the initiative to actually do what needs to be done, but I do it for me based on that prompt, which was vague enough that it doesn't become a whole dictatorial thing from somebody else. So now going back to 2 more habits that are great everyday habit. Journaling mistakes. I call it glitch list. I have all my clients in my practice. I had my kids do this. Write down a mistake in a little notebook, and a mistake doesn't need to be a big one. It could be that I left the towel on the floor. It can be a mistake, or it could be I've forgotten to use a sharpened pencil and my handwriting was illegible. So now what you do is you are encouraging encouraging the children to do self-reflection on their own. But what are you reflecting on? And often what happens is parents and teachers are reflecting on the biggest mistake immediately. but the smaller mistakes are not paid attention to, or they're kind of let go because nobody wants to make a big deal about it. But the child's, if you are thinking about the social and psychological development of that child, it's really important that they see that I'm a learner, and because I'm a learner, I make mistakes, not because I'm a flawed person and nobody else is flawed. In fact, it may be a great idea. You have a glitch list of your own, and you sit down next to each other and share your glitch list. That's a great idea. I recommend that you can do that even as young as 5-year-olds. Now, with 5-year-olds, we are not going to do a deeper reflection, but if you have a teenager, you will do that. If you're counselors and coaches who have a little bit more private time and a little bit opportunity to go deeper, then you can use that as a foundation to form a discussion and do something called patterns in error analysis. So you can have the students use a yellow marker and say, highlight all the parts that are mistakes that are similar, and now use another pink marker and say, highlight the mistakes in this group that are similar. And now what you can do is help them see patterns in their mistakes, because mistakes are nothing but failure to self-monitor. So there are patterns in the way you fail to monitor yourself, right? I mean, if you are an adult who locked yourself out, and then you are also the one who showed up to the airport without a passport, then those have the same pattern, which is you're not doing a check before you leave. So this kind of checking before you leave is a good habit or good routine to instill. So the routines can be solidified with the journals, and expect converting to-do list into a plan. A very important step I want to discuss is often parents and teachers work on to-do list. To-do list is not executive function proficiency demonstrate. To-do list doesn't necessarily demonstrate executive function proficiency. You know why? Because it just doesn't have time associated with it. So it needs to have two kinds of elements of time. First, how long? And second, when. So when you convert a to-do list into a plan, that's a routine. So getting your children to create a plan is actually first step is make a to-do list and then reorganize the to-do list in the order of execution. So how are we doing so far? So any questions? So because I'm going to talk about purpose. What does purpose mean? And what's the connection between executive function and purpose? So any thoughts, any comments? And sorry, James, I didn't get a chance to, I'm reading your comment now, is number one realistic in today's world? And you are absolutely right about technology. How can we really live without? So I don't really consider living without as much as just reining it back. I think the data just came out that people in US check their iPhone, their smart technology 200 times a day. And by the way, it is still lesser than some other parts of the world. So I just think it's a concern that we all need to be aware of, and then adjust according to whatever we think we can do. All right, so coming back to this idea, thank you, Jennifer. So what's purpose is meaningful focus. That's great. So it's a little bit bigger than that. Purpose is a combination of future thinking and motivation. Beth, that's a great thought. So you're bringing in another element. So it's meaningful focus. It is a combination of future thinking. There's one more element to it. Let's see if you guys can explore that a little bit. So here it is. So purpose is discovered by self. If you're a parent or a teacher and you say this is your purpose, it's not purpose. So Bill Damien is a great researcher from Stanford, and he has written a fantastic book called Path to Purpose. I'm going to link his podcast in your handout, so you should really watch it. But it has to be discovered by self, and that purpose entails long-term commitment. So the purpose always connects to long-term commitment. And a third thing is the purpose has meaningful value beyond oneself. So the purpose is not, I will achieve, I'll become a doctor. That is not as much as a purpose as I say, I will help people feel better or something like that. So kind of shifting the focus on the other. So the challenge, the research shows that in spite of this, there's a great awareness, and research talks about this, that those who have discovered the purpose have a lot greater meaningful life. And when you have found meaning, you're likely to rein in your impulses, and you're likely to redirect your attention in a meaningful way, and you're likely to actually continue to do hard work even when the work is hard. That's why it's really important that we discuss purpose in the context of learning and education. However, only 20% of high school kids, by the time they're in high school, discover their purpose. Only 20%. And that's something for us to think about. Why are kids not discovering or understanding purpose? So purpose endows a person with joy in good times and resilience in hard times. And this holds true for all throughout life. This is what Dr. Damien says. So let's talk about collective purpose and individual purpose. So I think because our children's brains are still developing, it might be a great idea for us to talk about a family's purpose. And it's really important. So we as a Kamath family, we talked a lot about in the house who we are. And one of the things we identified that was deeply meaningful to my husband and I, that we are people who do service. And so my children started taking part in service that we did, but of course, the purpose was parental purpose. And eventually, I'm very proud to say that both are young adults now, they're in college and one has graduated, they actually do a lot of service. That brings joy to them. They have found that meaningful for themselves. So you can actually have a discussion. And the reason I'm saying this is really, really important is because why are children getting bored? Why are they really not engaging? And they're not finding purpose in what you are putting in front of them. And yes, I completely understand that they may not really discover their purpose yet, but maybe we can shape the purpose, your purpose in, so I often say in my clinic, in my practice, that your purpose is to learn to become the best student you can be. And your purpose is to recognize that you don't know because you're a student. So the purpose is to discover your strengths and weaknesses. So that could be the purpose of your child's life in this context. So some of the strategies there is you can model your own dedication to your child towards a purposeful goal. Second, you can craft opportunities to observe people with purpose, not just you, but people with purpose. So in fact, taking them to a march and say, maybe if your friend is a great is a great literacy specialist, and she goes and teaches inner city skills, then you can say, hey, can you take my son or daughter and can you watch? If you're in school, if you are a teacher and you in your spare time you actually have a hobby, and then you can bring pictures of your hobby and you see, this is how I serve a life of purpose. So what you're doing is you're giving your children context in which they can actually operate and figure out a purpose for themselves. But the last strategy is do not directly tell the child what the purpose needs to be. Because again, as I said earlier, it has to be their discovery. And what you can do, you can till the soil so they can actually begin to discover that for themselves. So as we come to the end of the, I've spared some time so we can have a quick conversation or a little bit more. I'm going to bring my Zoom window. Sorry, I was not reading all the questions as I had a lot to cover, but now I can. So what are some of the takeaways that will help you facilitate school success? With this lens of transitions are really hard for children, and also that routines are created by others, and those are presented to children. So part of your job is to make sure the routines are memorized and inculcated as a predetermined sequence that they follow up. And finally, there is a EF culture in the house, in the classroom, and the children are often promoted to think about purpose. So what are some of the thoughts you have, and what do you think are the takeaways before I show you some of the takeaways I think that will add value to your parenting as well as teaching? And as this has given me a chance, James, to read your comments, so thank you for the clarification. So what are some of the takeaways that strike, make a, stick make sense to you and brings meaning to you? If you have some ideas, feel free to share. And if not, I have some suggestions for you all to think about. So start small. Please don't get overwhelmed by school starting, and do not ever think that you have to do it all for your children, and you have to uh, um, the child has to succeed in every aspect of life. No, it doesn't need to be that way. And don't, by the way, don't lose sight of two important things. Number one, a child is a child. That means his brain has not developed yet. And there's ample opportunity throughout this trajectory of learning that the child is going to develop. And even young adults, until what research is saying about age 30, the brain continues to develop. Second thing is set realistic expectations. The expectations have to really match where the child is. And if the child is not doing things that his peers are able to do, don't freak out, but also don't take it lightly, because I like to describe executive function challenge can be perceived in two ways. Are the peers doing it and your child is not doing it? Then it is an issue of concern. And second, it is expected of the child to engage in that particular way, and the child is not, then that is an issue of cooperation, and that should be also a concern. And when you see these two concerns, you need to step in as parents and teachers to support and promote the learning. Third, be consistent and bring consistency. And this is the nightmare for all of us, particularly both working parents, teachers who are playing different hats. They're coaches, and they're also doing some, they're part of some committee in school, and they're teaching gifted class, and they're running a regular class. There is so much pressure on each and every one of us, and it's really, really hard to be consistent. But I would say go back to the things that I was talking about, is those 5 routines. If you bring reflection into your daily life, you can be consistent with those routines. And if you are not going to come back at 4 o'clock a particular day, have an alternative routine. So this is a routine for everyday life, and this is a routine when we can't follow a routine. And so another thing I want you guys to think about, there need to be actually 4 routines that you define, which is predetermined sequence of events that repeats itself. A morning routine, back from school routine, homework routine, and end of the day routine. If you're a teacher, you need to have a getting started with school or getting started with class routine, engagement routine, which is how do I expect you to answer the questions. Third, getting ready to get homework routine, and rehearsal routine. That means wrapping up. Before you step out, I want you to say the things you're going to do next time. I want you to visualize before you do it. So if you embed this rehearsal in your classroom, then you actually are following a routine, but it's a mental one. Third, keep your emotions in check. By the way, executive function is nothing but emotional regulation. You are hopping mad, and you are actually now saying, go back to your room. I don't want to talk to you. Now what's happening is the child actually made a mistake, and child has engaged in behaviors that's egging you on, and you are feeling very frustrated. And because you're frustrated, you have actually broken a routine of making the child accountable, and you want to punish the child for being rude or not kind of cooperating with you, which makes sense. But it's really important that you do some mindful breathing, mindfulness reflection, and say, excuse me, I'll be right back. And you go to another room and say, what do I really want in this moment? What can I do that continues to maintain peace as I handle the challenges the child is feeling? And the last two is prompt frequently to pause and reflect. And lastly, but not the least, is have fun. Really, people, what you do is incredible. The children that you serve and raise is incredible. And I salute to all of you for your commitment to excellence. And I really thank you for your patience with our children, and thank the world for that we have it what it takes to tolerate some of the imperfections in children because they are children. And so I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today. So many of you showed up and signed up. So spread the word. If you have some great friends and interested parents and teachers who might benefit from listening to this talk, please do. And stay communicated, stay in touch with me. I will be sure to send you a handout, and it will have links to many podcasts and articles. So it will be a rich handout for you to revisit. And by the way, this will be available on demand. So thank you again for being with me today. I suppose I stop. I'm asking yes. Okay.